Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Intergenerational Solidarity Series, a podcast brought to you by Civic Voice, Inuka Kenya Nisisi, and The Elephant. I'm Darius Okola with episode 5 about a national dissent that has come to be known as the Gen Z protests. Joining me today is Muthoni Wanyeki.
Hi, how are you?
Karibu sana. So, as part of trying to understand what's happening in the country, it's almost 1 year since we had one of the biggest political moments. What do you make of it?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is you're right to say it's one of the biggest political moments, but it's not the only one. There have been big political moments in different generations over time. Before them, of course, was the constitutional change movement and so on. I think what was different, though, about this moment is we had always felt that the role of public intellectuals and the middle class and civic voices was to provide the ideas around which mass mobilization had to happen, but that those providing ideas were not that capable of mass mobilization. So you needed the churches or the mosques or the unions or political parties to provide the mass. I think what Gen Z did and showed us was you can have both. You can have ideas and you can have mass mobilization. And they didn't need the parties, they didn't need the religious bodies, they didn't need civil society, although civil society came in, I think, to try and support them behind the scenes as things unfolded. So that was quite unique in Kenya's history, I think. The other thing I think it showed us was the depth of the disagreement and the disenchantment that the majority of Kenyans, who are young people, feel about the governance of this country, about their opportunities in this country. Although they were quite focused at the beginning around the finance bill and provisions in the finance bill and overtaxation, it was a cry, I think, about economic justice, about opportunities lost that they don't feel they have. Educated, non-educated, urban, rural, it doesn't matter. They don't feel they have a space to be themselves and to grow and to flourish within this country.
Yeah. And tentatively, what would we say has been thus far the legacy of this political moment that we had last year?
Well, I think they achieved their original aims, which was quite focused around the finance bill. I think they've left us with many questions around the economic direction of this country, the political governance of this country. And in many ways, I feel the backlash and the kind of threat that they've created among the powers that be and this regime is dragging us backwards. I think they put the fear of God into the political class. So looked up that way, you can say the abductions, all of the assaults on civil liberties, things that we thought we had gotten rid of when we got rid of the Moi dictatorship, they're back. And friends of mine who were imprisoned under the Kenyatta One and the Moi dictatorship, detained, tortured, and so on, they were like, at least at that time, we were actively organizing to overthrow the government. So not that it excuses what happened to them, but they're like, these kids are being abducted for cartoons. So the depth of the lack of knowledge, I think, and the lack of ideas around how to address the issues raised by Gen Z on the part of the government is evident in their over-the-top, outrageous responses to what they perceive of as a threat, rather than a call for action.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is the fact that within the continent, this is not new. We had Fees Must Fall in South Africa. We had ANSAS in Nigeria, and similar movements in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Ghana, across in Senegal. What do you make of this the youth's political anxiety and the different ways they choose to express it, especially out in the streets?
I think what they're saying is what we have is just not good enough. I mean, each of those movements has been sparked by a very specific set of conditions and demands. NSARS was about the police and so on. Fees Must Fall was about higher education. But the disenfranchisement that the body of people called young, let's say people up to the age of 35, feel, even though they're the largest demographic, the sense of hopelessness that they feel and the sense of anger that they feel that they don't belong, right? They don't have opportunities. We have a geriatric kind of leadership across the continent. I mean, when you think about it, at independence, our leaders were in their 20s, mostly in their 20s or 30s. Now our leaders on average are in their 60s, 70s. I mean, the distance between them and these kids, or this young generation, or the bulk of the African population is huge. And the distance in terms of the expectations that young people have. You know, we live in an age of globalized media, right? And globalized popular culture. They have access to what kids have, what young people have all across the world. And they're like, why not us? Why not? And all around them, they just see disrepair, dysfunctional public services, lack of jobs, lack of income. So I think that's what they're responding to is the huge gap in expectation that they feel they should be entitled to at all these years post-independence, and what African states are delivering for them, which is nothing.
Part of the reaction to that has been, we've seen it in the Sahel, the rise of fairly young leaders. But even locally, we are seeing that quest expressed in different ways. We see young people teasing out the possibility of some of the leaders in the country. But does there exist a political program or a particular pathway that a young person trying to get into politics can use outside of the patronage network, really?
Well, the generation that I came of age in, I think many people saw civil society and sort of as a platform to a public awareness of who they were and what they stood for. Many political leaders who are women, for instance, women in active politics, came through the ranks of the FIDEs and, the women's rights movement. Similarly, many of our leaders post-transition, post-2002, came from civil society, the democracy movement. So that was a way to build a pathway to national recognition outside of the networks of political party activity, which are still, completely boring and tied to money and ethnicity and that kind of calculus, old school stuff. I think what Gen Z has shown us is that you can have a different way, but I don't think they've found that way yet. It is my understanding that some parts of the youth movement are discussing what do they stand for in a bigger sense, ideologically. What does it mean to sort of register yourself as voters, turn out to vote? What does it mean to put yourself forward to stand? I don't think they've I think they're in the process of becoming. I don't think they found a way. And, I'm sure you've seen some of the discussions about some of the leadership of Gen Z who the youth feel have been co-opted already. We remain to see what will happen over the next 2 years.
Your clusters also had to deal with that kind of a pushback reaction from the state, including co-option.
But you know, it was very different. We came of age, I grew up under the Kenyatta one dictatorship. I came of age in the Moi dictatorship. And I tried to put myself in the service of, you know, our great sort of leaders of the second liberation as foot soldiers, right? So we came from a situation where we knew we lived under a dictatorship, and we knew the price of living under a dictatorship and resisting it. I think the difference that these kids and Gen Z have had is that they thought they were free, which is great, right? But they were shocked by the reaction of the state. They actually did not expect to be abducted, to be tear gassed, to be beaten, to have the state run willy-nilly looking, you know, for ghosts of financiers all over the place. I mean, they were shocked. And in a way, the shock is good because you're like, oh, they had a much higher expectation of freedom than we did. We always knew the state, it can be devilish, and often is. But for them, this was a revelation. I think they're still trying to deal also with what that means. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. And part of also dealing with that is navigating the fact that one of the elements that has brought us to this moment is a lot of politics without progress. And in a sense, a lot of sort of democratic noise all over that doesn't translate to the kind of leadership we expected. How do you make sense of this gap, the robustness of it, or at least what it looks like vis-a-vis the outcome of what we see in terms of the dysfunction in the economy, in the politics, in academia?
You know, I feel what we have now is just nakedness, right? The nakedness of the theft. I mean, last week I was telling some friends, I opened the paper and I actually had to close it and put it down because it was one grand corruption scandal after another. If it was not all the money from the ETAs has gone into a private Swiss account, billions of shillings lost. I mean, it was just one after the other. And the amounts are mind-boggling, right? And this in a country where, you know, nothing in terms of public service practically is working. Yes, some roads are getting built. Yes, I guess some houses are getting built. We're being gouged for payments into the dysfunctional healthcare system. I mean, and the stories of the dysfunctional healthcare system are heartbreaking, you know? I mean, so I think what has happened is, despite all the work that we've put into the Constitution, into laws, into policies, all of that is there. At the Africa level, it's also there. Like, the normative framework is fine. But I feel where we have not made any progress at all is on stopping and addressing grand theft and gross human rights violations. I mean, you know, when you think about it, the media does its job, the Auditor General does her job, the parliamentary committees sometimes do their job about revealing and reporting on grand corruption. But then there's no uptake. I mean, they're just stealing and stealing and stealing and stealing, and the amounts get bigger and bigger and bigger, and nothing happens. There's no consequence. It's just naked theft. And I feel that's what politics has become. And I think that is the anger of Gen Z, is just, they see all of this happening. They're like, what the hell? I mean, where is our life? Where is our future? Where's public service? Whereas you want to tax our parents, but give us nothing. So I don't know, we're in a very explosive situation, I think, actually. Yeah, because it's just playing out in front of our eyes, and people feel they have nothing to lose, because what is the state giving them anyway?
Is this an indictment of the framework of the what we call democratic society, and how we organize essentially the nation state?
No, I think we've done a lot of work in terms of the structures of the state. Our Constitution is meant to provide us, and it does provide us, with a lot of protection, and it restored separation of powers and so on and so forth. But what we have is total capture of that by people who, for them, the state is basically a wallet, and our public money is basically theirs to use as they want. What we are dealing with is just the rapacious greed of an elite that does not care at all about what they're meant to be doing. It's like I say, it's completely naked. It's not in Kenya anyway, and at the African level. I feel the norms that people have fought for are good. They're good enough. What is not good is the incapacity of our institutions to withstand the impact of individuals who are hell-bent on stealing as much as they can, abusing people willy-nilly as they go along. People have no concept of what public service actually is, it seems.
Yeah, which is interesting because one of the ways with which the elites deal with the country is through elite convergence, especially when their interests are threatened. We've seen those symbolic handshakes and the governments of national unity and alliances here and there. What's interesting is, at least from a tentative observation, is that it's not delivering the kind of legitimacy they've always gotten historically. Could this be, in your assessment, beginning of the end of this kind of elite bargain as a way to get away with whatever they think they can get away with?
I'm of the school of thought and of not just the school of thought, but the organizations who have worked on what has happened with our elections from 2007 on. And I firmly believe there is no election we've had in Kenya that has not been tampered with at the presidential level. So in terms of the acquiescence after the fact of the opposition, I don't blame them. I mean, if you stand for election, you win one time after another. 2007, 2013, 2000. I don't blame the opposition for whatever they choose to do to deal with that fact. And I think they've actually acted with considerable grace. However, I understand the anger of Gen Z at this latest kind of co-option of the opposition, because we have an opposition made up of people who were real fighters for our second liberation. I mean, that we live here and have what we have now is due to many people within ODM, as it turns out. But the fact that they can seem to support a government that is stealing from them, is torturing them, abducting them, disappearing them, you can understand why the youth are so angry. And you can understand, too, if they have grown up never knowing a clean election, why that would be very hard for them to think of as a way out, right? Everyone's like, you get the leaders you deserve. You get the leaders you deserve if the electoral process is clean. No one can say we deserve the kind of governments that we've had, because our elections have not been clean since I've been aware of and involved in electoral processes.
One of the key players in this is the civil society. And there have been a lot of shifts and changes in that space. Would you say at this point it has the kind of tools needed to do the kind of work it does at the civic space in light of the kind of challenges that are there?
No, but I also feel that a reckoning is coming in terms of we in civil society may not have fully understood the roles we were meant to play and why, in terms of the aid, infrastructure, philanthropic infrastructure, and so on. And I think what we're dealing with now is a civil society that's kind of reeling from the withdrawal of sources of funding, without fully understanding that world and that rationale for their existence and for paying for their existence no longer exists. So yeah, we're moving into, I feel, a post-ODA world, a post-philanthropic world, a post-civil society of that particular form that we've known in the 90s, early 2000s. Something else is coming.
Tentatively, what is your sense of what it could be? What kind of shape is it supposed to take to be able to deal with a kind of 21st century?
Professional organizations, I think, will become a lot stronger and a lot more relevant. Of course, in Kenya, they've always been the law societies and the ICJs and the medical associations, the unions. So, in some ways, traditional forms of civil society organizing will make a comeback. I think the youth have yet to show us, Gen Z have yet to show us. We've had inklings of it last year, but when you can organize across the country through, social media, through networks that you have, they don't need offices, they don't need salaries, they don't need any of those things. They can crowdfund. The state was going mad trying to find, is it the Ford Foundation funding them? Is it Jimmy Wanjigi funding them? Is it, running around like a chicken with his head cut off, when if they had just paid attention, they would have seen. After protest one, Gen Z were like, we're crowdfunding for hospital bills, whatever. Within 24 hours, they had raised a few million shillings to pay for bills and things, just well-wishers. And that is very interesting, actually, because it means we don't need foreign money. And people are prepared to pay for people's own resistance within the country. So we'll see. I feel they're interesting inklings in what happened that, let's see.
When you think about labor movements and labor unions, from Mark seeing all the way 60, 70 years ago, but we are in this new space where it's not very clear what's their role in terms of engaging the Gen Zs and the political moment.
No, I mean, our unions were captured during the colonial years, explicitly so, through their constitutions that directly linked them to the ruling party. Some unions have clawed themselves back into relevance and some haven't. And unfortunately, the umbrella body of unions, I like Francis Atwoli as a person, but really, it's captured, right? So we'll see. And also, forms of work are quite different for this young generation and post-COVID than they used to be. We have a dwindling manufacturing sector. I don't know. Worker organizing is going to be quite different, I think.
Yeah. And that has an implication for corporate in general. We saw some of them get cancelled by these Gen Zs because of perceived, sometimes actual affiliation with the state.
Which is brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, boycotts have always been a way to express annoyance with corporate complicity with ABCD. That's, I mean, the disinvest movement, the boycott, sanction, disinvest movement helped bring about the fall of apartheid. The Palestinians are trying to get their BDS movement going. But yes, corporates needing to be accountable to their consumers is increasingly going to be important.
Okay. Interesting. And in terms of, in a sense, we are about a few years out, at least quite some months out from the general elections, 2027. From the crystal ball, what do you see as some of the key reorientations coming up down the road, and what would they mean for?
I think the old men will do what the old men have always done, and unfortunately, the young men with them. The ethnic calculus, the regional calculus is boring. It's so boring. It's overdone. But you can see that's what they know how to do. For me, what will be interesting is how Gen Z choose to engage themselves in the electoral process or the political process, even if they don't want to go into party politics as such. Yeah, but I mean, what's going to happen with the mainstream politician? They don't know anything different. They're just going to keep doing the same old, same old. Boring.
Yeah.
Really boring.
And then there's, yeah, and then there's the fourth estate.
Yes.
What's your assessment of how they've navigated this political moment so far, and what bodes for them?
I mean, the media is very prone to capture. It's as prone to capture as anyone else. It depends on ownership. It depends on sources of advertising revenue. It depends on many, many things. I don't know if you know, but I used to be a columnist, and there was a time that 7 of us walked away from the nation because we felt at that particular time the nation had been captured. Some people have since found their way back. But I think the role of platforms like The Elephant, the role of shows like this, the role of short clips that the youth can use, all of that is really important. We host the UN Rapporteur for Debt and Human Rights, Professor Atia Waris, who teaches at the university. Tax is her area. And she was telling me that she ended up getting targeted around the Gen Z protest because the youth are so clever. They were downloading her report on debt and like just turning it into fast little bits I was like, that's amazing. When I was active in civil society, it was constantly like, how do we do civic education? It was something that you had to fundraise for and plan for. Boring. And these youth, they were like, let's take a report, let's turn it into little TikToks and whatever and send it out. I was like, that is amazing. So, yeah, the way information is being shared now is also very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and the mainstream is still here.
Yeah, the mainstream is still here. And like I say, they blow with the wind depending who their owners are and how they're threatened or how their journalists are threatened. Yeah.
I'm thinking about religion, or the church, the clergy, and the imams, and the respective religious elements. There have been a whole mixed bag of reactions from that space, which is different from what was in the 90s, I presume.
Very different. I mean, very different. I remember, this series of protests, national protests for the constitutional change. The mobilization was done by the mosques and the churches. But we've gone through a period of real capture. We've gone through a period of the rise of evangelical churches, the rise of more Wahhabist kind of approaches to Islam. They're quite conservative, like in some areas, So, I'm not that positive. I mean, we've seen more recently some statements from the Catholics around the treatment of the youth, around the state of the economy, but they're a very weak shadow of what they were in the 90s, it's true.
Yeah. I'm thinking in terms of, we lost about 67 youths that's accounted for. There's about, by the last count, about 29 or thereabout still missing. What is the sense of recourse, both political and legal, exists in light of history?
I think people are doing what they can. They're documenting, they're making sure they support the families of the missing, of the disappeared in terms of court processes and so on. What more can you do? They're trying to talk about the issues, trying to embarrass Kenya for its behavior. It's so obvious the state is behind this. I think people are doing what they can do.
Has this yielded results? Because we lost people in the 90s and the 80s.
We have lost a lot of people, but we have gotten, some of the youth have returned, thank God. But yeah, I mean, when you look at, this is what I mean about Gen Z having been born free, and then, which is a very South African way of expressing, you know, people who were born post-apartheid. For us, it was people who were born post the end of the dictatorships and being shocked that a state can do this. Disappear people for drawing cartoons. It's crazy.
Yeah, and
you know, many of the things that we had fought for and worked on through the 90s and the early 2000s, oversight of the police, that the police have to be clearly marked. You should be able to tell who's in front of you. I mean, what is this? Police being allowed to do their duties in baklavas. I mean, with no identification. Of course, it doesn't lend itself to accountability for their behavior. And it's part of the slow slide back to the days of the dictatorship. And we have to remember, I mean, Ruto came of age in the Moi dictatorship as part of YK92. This is how he knows how to operate, just brute force.
yeah, and then there's the element of foreign policy and image regionally. Lots of changes in light of what happened last year, and some of it clearly quite consequential, and some in a not so good way. How do we navigate this moment in light of that?
You know, I have to say that Kenya is kind of known as being a regional power or a regional hegemon, but always being on the wrong side of history on many, many issues. On the wrong side of history when it comes to Palestine, on the wrong side of history when it comes to the Kurds, on the wrong side of history when it comes to apartheid, and that continues, I would say. On the one hand, we have a new foreign policy. We have a Kenya that wants to assert itself on the Pan-African front. On the other hand, you're just like, oh my God, what are they doing? You know, comments about the working with Macron in the Congo, and the Francophones are like, oh, what are you saying? RSF organizing their meeting here, you're like, oh my God, you know, and I don't know. We have very skilled people working within foreign affairs. Monica Juma I don't know who is advising who or how this is happening, actually.
Speaking of advice, what would you advise these young people who, in light of the anniversary coming up, they want to go back in the streets? They're still very clear about some of, at least, the alleged provisions of 2025.
I think they should talk to people who came before them. You know, when I first came back to Kenya after university, I was 23 years old. I wanted to be involved in the pro-democracy movement. I learned so much from talking to people. Just being out there and talking to people, you know, I learned a lot from one of the leaders of Kudeha, which was one of the last independent unions. Learned a lot from the Mau Mau veterans. You're just like, our elders are our resources. They're what inspired me to do what I have tried to do. And I think Gen Z would benefit a lot from talking to people, just because the history of our independence and of the second liberation is not really written.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Muthoni Wanyeki, always a pleasure.
Thank you.